On January 29, 1986, a surveying crew discovered human remains down an embankment near Lake Elsinore off the Ortega Highway in California. Investigators were unable to identify the victim, who had died from an apparent gunshot wound, and her identity would remain unknown for the next 35 years. Finally, in January 2022, the Riverside County District Attorney's Office announced that the partial human remains belonged to Linda Louise LeBeau. Linda was born April 10, 1950. At some point in her life, she married Philip LeBeau, but the two would later divorce. Around the time she disappeared, which was 9 years before her remains were found, she had been moving on and had a new love in her life. However, her ex, LeBeau, was apparently not happy about this and had been giving her new boyfriend trouble. On the evening of Thursday, October 6, 1977, 27-year-old Linda had met LeBeau at Love's Restaurant, which is now a Denny's, in Tustin, California. She was supposed to collect $300 from him from damage he had caused to her boyfriend's car in a jealous rage. Afterward, she was at a Texaco at what's now a Starbucks at Red Hill Avenue in El Camino Real. Witnesses saw Linda arguing at the gas station with another man whom investigators believe was LeBeau inside her 1971 Volkswagen van. Linda got gas, then got into her vehicle and accidentally backed into someone else's car. She then jumped out of the Volkswagen and ran towards Red Hill Avenue, but the man she was with, believed to be LeBeau, chased after her and grabbed her by the arm, and they returned to her vehicle. It's unclear why she took off running after the accident. Linda spoke to the driver of the car she hit, and he gave her his contact information, and this was the last time she was ever seen alive again. Her boyfriend would quickly report her missing, and 3 days later, her Volkswagen with her purse inside was found along the shoulder of the Red Hill Freeway on-ramp to the southbound I-5 freeway. Police later learned LeBeau returned home to his girlfriend much later than he was expected that night, wearing a different set of clothes and wet. He told investigators he was reminiscing at the house off Ortega Highway where he and Linda once lived, and then he strangely stopped for a swim. In 2007, her surviving family members provided their DNA to assist in identifying any remains belonging to Linda that may ever be found. After they provided their DNA, the Justice Department notified the Tustin police, who had long forgotten about the case. That's when they found an old report that explained how she was last seen after a suspicious traffic accident on October 6, 1977. When her van was found a few days later, her personal possessions were inside, and there were no signs of a fight. After speaking with her loved ones, children, and boyfriend, they found out that she had often been abused by her ex-husband, LeBeau. She often showed up at work with black eyes, her apartment was burglarized, and sentimental things from her new relationship were taken, and her new boyfriend's car had sugar put into its gas tank and his tires slashed. Police are still looking to speak to two old co-workers of Linda's named Sarah Ferguson and a woman named Yoko from the company Addressograph Multigraph Corporation, where she worked as an office clerk. Investigators believe these women may have crucial missing details about the case. Linda was born with the surname Durnall and loved car racing, boating, and sailing. She and LeBeau had met at the Orange County International Raceway. Her brother recalled LeBeau treating his sister well in the beginning, but soon after marrying, things turned bad, and after only 4 years, they divorced. Thankfully, Linda got her name back, but LeBeau, who died in 2008 of natural causes, still remains the primary suspect in her murder. On January 12, 1981, a dog in Houston, Texas, wandered out of the woods near Wallaceville Road carrying an arm. Upon investigation, the remains of an adult male and female were discovered. A pair of green gym shorts and a bloody towel were also found near their bodies. It was determined they were the victims of homicide and had been there about 2 months before being found. Unable to determine their identities, they became known as Harris County Does and were buried in the Harris County Paupers Cemetery. With a lack of identification, officials hired an artist to create sketches based on photos of the deceased, but once again, no leads were obtained, leaving them at another dead end. 30 years later, in July 2011, the couple's bodies were exhumed in order to collect DNA to determine if the two were related, but they weren't. The case remained cold for 40 years until 2021, when Identifinders International requested the remains to test. The funding was provided by AudioChuck, a media company that produces the podcast Crime Junkies. They then uploaded the information to GEDmatch, and within 10 days, using genetic genealogy, a genetic genealogist was able to narrow down the male's possible identity from close cousins living in Kentucky. She began searching for contact information for his cousins and other relatives and found a potential sister still living in Florida. When contacted, the sister, Donna Brooks, stated that not only has her brother been missing for 40 years, but also his wife and baby too. Her DNA confirmed that the male remains did in fact belong to her 21-year-old brother, Harold Dean Clouse Jr., that she called Junior. His wife, 17-year-old Tina Gail Linn Clouse, was then identified as well. The genealogist had already located Tina's grandparents in a family tree, but was unable to confirm her identity yet because they had 11 children who had moved to 6 different states. Tina was born in Florida, where birth records are kept private, so it was a little more difficult. Before discovering her identity through Donna, she had begun contacting cousins all over the country in the large extended family, but no one was returning calls or emails. One cousin even yelled at her and hung up after saying that a deceased first cousin had nothing to do with him. Once Dean's sister told her of the marriage, she was able to pull up the marriage record and confirmed that she was the granddaughter of the already identified grandparents she had been researching. Sadly, their 1-year-old baby, named Holly Marie Clouse, was still missing. No baby was found with the couple's bodies, and so far, no baby doe cases have been found that match her description. Harold, known as Dean or Junior, grew up in New Smyrna, Florida. He enjoyed taking care of people, but sometimes made poor decisions in his life, and in the mid-1970s, his mother Donna said he had even run off once and joined a cult. However, upon returning home, he would meet and fall in love with Tina. He would also begin working as a Finnish carpenter for home builders. Tina grew up in a challenging home and was excited to be married. He and Tina quickly married in 1979 and had a baby named Holly Marie. In 1980, Dean was offered a job with builder D.R. Horton, building custom cabinets in new homes in Houston, Texas. He decided to move his family there to work full-time to make more money to better care for Tina and Holly. He borrowed his mother's car, agreeing he would eventually buy the car. After they moved to Louisville, near Dallas, they would often send letters to their family back home, but in late 1980, those letters stopped. The last letter was sent in early December 1980 when Tina sent home pictures of the couple's 1-year-old daughter to Dean's mother in Florida. Dean was periodically involved with a religious group known either as the Brethren or the Jesus People, with ties to Florida, Texas, and Oklahoma, and may have reconnected with them in Texas. His car was found in Los Angeles, California, several months after the couple was murdered, but their family had no way of knowing that the couple was already dead. In mid-1981, a man called Dean's mother and said someone could drive his car to the Daytona Speedway from California for $1,000. She agreed in hopes of finding out information about their whereabouts. Someone calling herself Sister Suzanne, along with 2 young women, arrived dressed in religious-looking robes. When Dean's mother started asking questions, the 2 younger women began trying to answer her, but were immediately cut off and forbidden to talk by Sister Suzanne. Sister Suzanne would then tell her Dean and Tina were with their group now and didn't want to see or talk to their family anymore and wanted to cut ties. However, unbeknownst to her, Sister Suzanne was not being honest, as the murdered couple had already been discovered. After talking with the religious group, Dean and Tina's families reported them missing. If Holly is still alive and was raised by someone else, she would be 42 years old as of January 24th, 2022, and may not know anything about her true identity and may have been given a different date of birth. She may have grown up around a religious community that called themselves by the titles brother or sister and may have been related to the Jesus people in Chicago. Dean's mother is now 80 years old and finally has some closure. On July 31st, 1997, a maintenance worker picking up trash in a roadside park in Ada Township, Grand Rapids, Michigan, found human remains in a wooded area behind some outbuildings. The body was determined to be that of a black female between the ages of 20 to 30 years old. Her teeth showed a lack of dental care, and she was likely killed between March and August of 1996. A reconstruction clay model was recreated by a Michigan State Police forensic artist in 2009, but it did not help in determining her identity. Unable to determine her identity, she became known as Ada Bones Jane Doe, 1997, for the next 25 years. In 2020, the DNA Doe Project took the case and attempted to create a DNA profile from the bones. The initial attempt was unable to create a workable sample, but in 2021, Hudson Alpha Discovery combined and enriched the samples and uploaded it to GEDmatch. It took the volunteer genealogist just 1 week to come up with a likely candidate. Using genetic genealogy, the family tree led them to a particular county in Mississippi, and from there, they were able to tie together some descendants of common ancestors who had relocated to Benton Harbor, Michigan. A family member of the likely candidate then confirmed it by having their DNA compared to the victims. On January 5, 2022, it was announced that the Jane Doe was 31-year-old Stephanie Renee Judson. Stephanie was born in 1966 in Benton Harbor and had been living in Grand Rapids, Michigan since 1980. She was described as having a good heart, but began hanging out with the wrong crowd at an early age. Stephanie's family said she moved from Benton Harbor to Grand Rapids with Gregory Kelly, a violent repeat offender who was later convicted of sex trafficking and died in prison in 2020 from COVID-19. Stephanie had left behind a sister and 2 children who had searched for her extensively over the years. Sadly, her mother died just 2 months before the announcement was made and never learned that her daughter had been found or identified. They didn't know Stephanie had been found in 1997, but they did know that she was a victim of sex trafficking and substance abuse. She had somewhat lost contact with her family, but would reach out on birthdays and holidays. The family never stopped looking for her, and just last year, her son wished her a happy birthday on Facebook, also writing, "You are missed wherever you are." It's believed that she may be the final victim of a serial killer in the Grand Rapids area in the 1990s. On May 5, 2012, a deputy with the Talladega County Sheriff's Office patrolling a rural area on Allred Road in Lincoln, Alabama, noticed the front door to a vacant home was wide open and decided to investigate. While searching the backyard, the deputy discovered female human remains. She was wearing a navy sweatshirt, blue sweatpants, and off-white house shoes. She had been there a while, making the retrieval of fingerprints impossible. She did have the word powders engraved on her dentures, but even with that, they were unable to identify her. The location she was found is less than 5 miles from the Talladega Superspeedway, often used by NASCAR. At the time she was discovered, the Superspeedway was holding a multi-day race event with thousands in attendance. She was believed to be a white female between the ages of 45 and 65 years old. The Alabama Department of Forensic Sciences would determine that she did have lung cancer, but there are still some suspicious circumstances around the time she was last seen. 3 months later, she was entered into NamUs and NCIC, but her description did not match any local missing person cases, and the case went cold, and she became known as Lincoln Jane Doe. Using donations for the lab testing by DNA Solved crowdfunding, forensic genetic genealogist Carla Davis and the Lincoln Police Department partnered with Authorm Incorporated to help determine her identity. Using DNA from the autopsy, Carla Davis began tracing a family tree of the deceased. Carla was able to determine the remains belonged to 67-year-old Jean Turner Ponders. Jean was born April 14, 1945, in Maynardfield, Tennessee. Upon graduation from Lincoln Memorial University, she moved to Chatsworth, Georgia, and began her teaching career. This is where she would meet and marry Willie Ponders, known as Bill, and together they had 3 children, Jason, Jonathan, and Jennifer. She taught several decades in Murray and Whitfield counties in Georgia as both a high school biology teacher and reading and biology teacher at the middle school. She was described as a really good cook, a loving mother and grandmother, and loved to garden. Jean and Bill would divorce after 30 years of marriage. He got the house in the divorce, forcing her to move out. After that, she lived in Dalton, Calhoun, Sandy Springs, and at the time of her death, she was living in Willio Creek community in Roswell, Georgia. Her sister stated on Jean's Facebook page that the last time she talked to her was on the phone, and the two had talked about Jean visiting her the upcoming weekend, but one of her children had her car, and she was going to find someone to give her a ride. Jean told her that she had met a girl from Sandy Springs that was planning on traveling to Maryville, Tennessee, and would drop Jean off at her sister's house on the way. The woman she would be riding with had a boyfriend who had just gotten out of prison for murder. Her sister was worried and tried to talk her out of going, but Jean told her she would be okay, and that was the last time she heard from her sister. When Jean didn't arrive to her sister's, she assumed she had taken her advice and didn't go through with her plans. But when she tried to call her a few weeks later, her phone was disconnected. She didn't think much of it at the time because Jean said a family member had her phone on her account and often threatened to remove her. Jean's son called his aunt a few months later and asked if his mom was at her house. They both realized that neither of them had heard from her in a long while and began investigating her disappearance. Although it is common practice for dentures to be labeled with either initials or names, the name was misspelled as Powders instead of Ponders. Investigators are still trying to determine the circumstances that led to her remains ending up in Talladega County, Alabama, behind the abandoned home. On November 6, 1994, human remains were found by rabbit hunters in a cornfield near a wooded area at the south end cul-de-sac of 32nd Avenue, just north of I-96 in Wright Township, Ottawa County, Michigan. Investigators believe the victim had ended up there sometime between May and September of 1994. Investigators at the time thought she was a Hispanic or Latino female between the ages of 35 and 45 years old, and her cause of death was ultimately ruled a homicide. She had wavy brown auburn hair and a healed fracture in her lower back. Black stretch pants, pink underwear, and blue high-heeled shoes were found near the body. Detectives theorize that she may have been a victim of serial killer Larry Dwayne Hall. Unable to determine her identity, she became known as Matilda Ottawa County Jane Doe, 1994. In 2007, a DNA profile of the victim was obtained and entered into the CODIS database, but no matches were found. In February 2021, the DNA Doe Project took on the case and began using her DNA profile and genetic genealogy to determine her identity. The DNA profile of the remains indicated North Atlantic and French-Canadian ancestry, not Hispanic as was originally thought. Starting with second and third cousin matches, the genealogists worked their way through the Jane Doe's family tree until they came across a missing persons report from Minneapolis from October 1993 that seemed like a good match to the Jane Doe. Detectives from the Ottawa County Sheriff's Department contacted relatives of the possible match and were able to obtain DNA confirmation of the relationship. On January 20, 2022, the Ottawa County Sheriff's Office and the DNA Doe Project announced the identification as Shelly Rae Christian. Shelly was born with the surname Keppert on February 13, 1964, and had been living in Minneapolis, Minnesota, which is also where she was last seen. She was reported missing by her family in October 1993 at the age of 29, and her body was found over 1 year later on November 6, 1994, almost 600 miles away in Michigan. The team was able to identify a couple born in Iowa in the 1840s as ancestors of the then unknown woman, which provided the first breakthrough in the case. In an attempt to confirm that this was the right person, they found a German baptismal record from the mid-1800s that tied a hitherto mystery DNA match to a separate ancestral line of hers, which confirmed that Matilda Doe was in fact Shelly. Her suspected killer, Larry Hall, remains behind bars for the 1993 kidnapping and murder of 15-year-old Jessica Roach. There still remains 9 Jane Does that are believed to be his victims, in addition to 7 identified. It is speculated that he killed between 39 and 44 females during the 1980s and 1990s. Many are still missing or remain Jane Does, and he had confessed to about 14 of the murders, but later recanted most of them. He often left similar injuries on his victims, and many were found near Civil War memorials, most likely due to the fact that he enjoyed attending war reenactments. He has not been charged for any other murders besides Jessica's, and was dubbed the Springfield Three. He lived in Indiana and would often travel with or without his twin brother. He has an IQ of 80, and like many serial killers, he was teased and picked on during school years and had an abusive home life. At this time, there is very little information available about Shelly, but she now has her name back, and hopefully her family has some type of closure.